Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 411, and this is Lecture 3A, the beginning of this little block of material on what is often called the period of classical liberalism. So this period was not really completely dominated by classical liberals, but it was the period in which their ideas emerged and began to influence people throughout the West. And many of these important intellectuals from this period are still read today, still have an impact today. So they're important in the long run as well as in the short run in their own periods. Most of them, actually I think all the ones we're going to cover in this chapter except for Kant, are empirically based. That is that they're looking at how people are behaving in their societies and trying to develop theories to explain that behavior. And some of those theories are ethical theories, right? They're trying to understand rules of conduct, both in terms of how they affect individual behavior and success, but also in terms of kind of the logical foundations of those ethical ideas that people have in their heads during their day. And so these intellectuals provide us with a nice window into their societies. And this is especially true of Montesquieu and Smith, who are careful observers, very interesting and thoughtful men in terms of the way they interpret the facts that they've observed. And also, they're both widely read, so they're also influenced by previous ideas about these phenomena. So in a sense, these two guys are taking us back to Aristotle. Right? Aristotle was a person who was an inductivist. He read and listened widely. He looked at the world as much as he could himself, and also through his teams of people working at his school, and used that fact base and the idea base to create his own kind of synthesis of how the Athenian world and the greater world operated. So we spend a lot of time on ideas that emerged between 1500 and 1700, in part to kind of set up some kind of foundation for the next two chapters, which are the most important ones. So in that period, 15 to 1700, you saw some shift, in some ways a radical shift in terms of the way people thought about markets. Right, we started off with Erasmus and More, both of which were highly skeptical of the role that commerce should play in a good life or a good society. And in fact, More basically argues that commerce should be minimized rather than maximized. We saw that in the days of the Dutch Republic, that there were important, widely read intellectuals who reached basically the opposite conclusion, that international trade should be free and open, and that generally speaking, commerce was a blessing rather than a corrupting influence on society. That in fact, commerce tended to reinforce important virtues such as industry and honesty and frugality, and people who practice those virtues tended to be highly successful, and their societies tended to be highly successful. And all four of these gentlemen regarded their ideas to have divine foundations. That is, that they were all theists. They believed that a divine being basically put the universe in motion, wanted certain things to happen, and that what you observed was consistent with what they wanted to happen. And therefore, if you got good results, ones that seem virtuous and desirable and attractive, then that must be a product of divine intent. And therefore they would argue that their conclusions, although they were in most of these cases based on secular types of reasoning, also had divine support. An exception to that rule was the work of John Locke, John Locke was, his arguments essentially rely entirely on secular reasoning. There is very little or no connection back to theological texts. And so you could argue that he is kind of marking a dividing line between approaches to ethics in social science and other issues in philosophy, and the more religious-based ones that before him. In the 18th century, you'll see that all the figures that we point to, even Kant, who to some extent can be regarded as a bit of a throwback to this more religious attitude about ethics, are essentially using secular reasoning. Okay, you see almost no mention of any kind of theological connection between their arguments and the world around them. Right? So there's in this group of scholars, intellectuals, reason is the foundation, and also they're counting on some kinds of basic intuitions to get their reasoning off the ground. But those intuitions are validated really by having, insofar as their readers share those intuitions, and that is why that's one of the reasons they provide a nice window into how people in their century and their societies were thinking about things. Not that everyone was on the same page as these guys that we're reviewing. But literate people who were at that time able to kind of influence public policies, write books and papers and editorials and so forth for the mass readership of that time, that all those people were heavily influenced by these ideas, even when they were not completely on board with them. Okay, and you'll see that the ideas in this century become better grounded in observations, and there's also kind of an effort to distill principles down to a single idea, a little bit like Newtonian mechanics, only applied to ethics and politics and economics. And that's different from earlier work, which relied on kind of multiple ideas to reach particular conclusions. A blend of, for example, of theological reasoning, texts from old ancient scholars, and contemporary observations and opinion. So the 18th century is also a period where you start to see the beginnings of the Great Acceleration. There was a bit of an acceleration in England and in the Netherlands in this period from 1500 to 1700, but it ramps up a bit more in this century. So the growth rates in 1800 are really significantly higher than they were in 1600 or 1500. Okay, we still haven't got the Great Acceleration. Okay, but it's beginning to take off. And according to the logic of this this book, it's taking off because of shifts in norms that are starting to make markets work more efficiently. Rates of innovation are increasing, rates of scientific and technological advance are increasing, and capital is being accumulated. All these things are, to some extent, generated by changes in attitudes about what the good life and good society look like, and associated changes in behavior at the individual level, and also in changes in government policies. Okay, these have not fully taken off yet, but they're beginning to, and that's historically what's important about this century for an economist, and for the purposes of this book, that those shifts are arguably driven by these shifts in norms that took place in Northwestern Europe and in the American colonies during this period. So towards the end of the century, there were a couple of big historical events that are also important. There was the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But essentially, I'm arguing that those big political events were consequences of normative shifts that had already taken place before those events transpired, and that they didn't have enormous effects on the norms and ideas about the universe that people had in their head in the years afterwards. Although they had some effect, I mean, they wouldn't say that they had no effect. And in Europe, certainly a lot of medieval institutions were really shaken up by the French Revolution and the Napoleon's great military enterprises throughout Europe. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the medieval order is still really evident throughout Europe in this period. Governance is still everywhere but the Netherlands, essentially family-based, with inherited titles. And essentially every place but the Netherlands had a state monopoly church, some of those churches being quite open and others being quite closed, that had special privileges and received money from the state to fund some of its operations. Nonetheless, worldviews were changing. The Earth went around the sun instead of the sun around the Earth. The scope size of the planet had been better charted and understood. The New World, North and South America, were explored and mapped. Australia was on the map, the European map. And so there were kind of significant changes in the way people thought of themselves and their societies that were taking place as a consequence of events in the previous century or so. But still, I think it's fair to say that in Europe, at least, this medieval order is still pretty strong. It was not nearly as evident in the Netherlands or in North American colonies as it was in the rest of what we call the West today. And it's probably partly for that reason that the readers, the readings that we go through now are mostly from England, fewer from the Netherlands this time, the United States, but also France and Germany. So with that introduction to this block of material, we're going to talk today about just two of these people. That's probably giving them a little bit more time than they deserve, actually, given the powerhouses that we're going to be covering next time. But we're going to talk about Montesquieu, who is a French nobleman who had the resources and time and interest to become a significant scholar, indeed a major scholar, and arguably the first modern social scientist. And we'll also be talking about Ben Franklin. Oops, I left off the L. Ben Franklin is not a person that would be on most reading lists of intellectual history. I included him in this book and this class for a couple of reasons. One is that Max Weber, writing a couple of hundred years later, argued that Franklin's work, readings and writings, really captured the essential spirit of capitalism. And he gave him quite a bit of prominence in his book on the emergence of capitalism after the Protestant Reformation. I also think that Franklin's writings provide a nice window into the sentiments that American economists had about the role of markets in a good life and good society. And in a way, because he's not writing for an intellectual audience, he's writing for a mass audience in most of the things that we're collecting. It provides actually a better window into American thinking about markets and commerce and virtues than some of the more intellectual books do on their respective societies. And Franklin is an interesting character in his own right. He writes pretty well, and he thinks really clearly on just an enormous number of issues. So he's interesting for lots of reasons, but for the purposes of this course, because he provides really an excellent window into ideas about virtue, commerce, and the good society that were commonplace in the Mid-Atlantic colonies and to some extent North and South of those colonies. And with that, I'll switch over to the slides, which are, as usual, going through in some more detail the words and ideas of the scholars being reviewed, Montesquieu and Franklin today, with me trying to help along the translation of their ideas back into modern English and make it a little bit easier for you all to understand what they're getting at. Now, I always include the quotes from these guys so that you have some direct experience with their writings. Montesquieu is writing in French, of course, and he's a Frenchman, and so we're using a translation. Franklin wrote in pithy, American English, which hasn't changed all that much in the past couple hundred years, although you'll see little changes here and there. So a little less work is required to interpret Franklin than Montesquieu or some of the authors we'll be looking at next time. So here are the slides for Lecture 3A. And this from Chapter 11 of the book, which currently has the title Classical Liberalism, Ethics, and Commerce in the 18th Century. I decided to start this set of slides with a picture of Montesquieu's birthplace, the Chateau de Breda, which you can see is a kind of modest home. It's centered in a lake, and that's in part because it used to be a fortress, and the lake or pond used to be a moat around the castle that would keep dangerous people away from the home of the noble leader of the local community. It had gates and all kinds of good stuff, a normal castle, but by this time France was more sedate, less subject to attacks from neighbors and or peasants, although that part hadn't yet gone away entirely yet, as the French would learn in another 30 or 40 years. But it gives you a sense of the wealth that his family had, and although this man was born Charles Louis de Secondat, when he inherited the titles of Baron of Breda and Baron of Montesquieu, he became an independently wealthy person and gave up his career in law to pursue politics, science, and scholarship. So in my introductory lecture, I mentioned that the 17th century was a period in which some significant changes took place. Although the medieval order, for the most part, continued in place, it was beginning to change, not just in the Netherlands, where the change was most obvious, but also in the English colonies of North America, and to some extent in England itself. Towards the end of this period, England went through a whole series of political catastrophes, I suppose, in a sense. During the second half of the 17th century, they had the English Civil War. They had the Restoration, where the king resumed the throne, and they had the Glorious Revolution, which caused Parliament to become a co-equal part of government in the late 17th century in a manner that it had never really been before in English history. In English history up to that time, the king had really dominated Parliament in all the periods except for during the Civil War. So as a consequence of these scientific improvements, of the changes in their knowledge of the Earth and the sense of where the Earth was in the universe, that it was no longer taken to be the center of the universe, but something that orbited some other body, namely the sun. All these changed the way people thought about themselves and about their societies and about the Earth and so forth. And one of the impacts of this was kind of an increase in tolerance for disagreement. And this increase in tolerance allowed more experimentation, more writing on controversial issues, and so forth to take place than was possible in the earlier system. And this is part of the reason that the 18th century wound up being a much more interesting and in some ways revolutionary period in terms of thinking than the 17th or the time before it. So Montesquieu is writing in France, which is at this time essentially run by a dictatorship, although formally France has a parliament. It's never called. In fact, it hasn't been called for at least a century at this point in its history. And the king basically ran everything, noble families had some independence, but essentially it was the old medieval order adapted to the nation state that had emerged in France during the previous 200 years. Charles Louis II inherited 2 titles. That's the way titles moved around Europe in those days. You could marry into a title, or you could inherit a title, or if a family died out, the title could be transferred to a new family by the king. So these titles are almost like last names. And in fact, Charles Louis II essentially became known as his second barony as Montesquieu. And I think hardly anybody remembers his birth name when we first take up reading his work. His inheritance allowed him to retire from the law at the age of 27, devote himself to running his baronies, his local politics in the region of France that he was living in, and also science and scholarship. And of course, it's scholarship that he's most remembered for. It is the latter that brings him to our attention, specifically his magnum opus, The Spirit of the Law, published in 1748, which analyzes the origins of a nation's laws and government. And you could make a case that his book is really the beginning of modern social science. It was observation-based, closely reasoned, and dealt with politics in a sophisticated way, with sociology in a sophisticated way, with ethics in a sophisticated way, although that wasn't the central interest of the book, and also dealt with connections between countries' laws and government and its weather, its climate, its environment. So a fairly sophisticated piece of work. But we're only interested in a small part of that book that deals with politics, ethics, and markets. I think he's most remembered for his work on political theory. There are chapters in the book that analyze favorably both divided governments of the variety that England had at this point in time, and also federal systems of the sort that the Netherlands and Switzerland had at that time. And basically, he argues that ethical support is required for democracies to achieve good results, and this need for ethics tends to be greater for democracies than for other forms of government. So he goes on to say that there is no great share of probity necessary to support a monarchical or despotic government. The force of laws in one and the prince's arm in the other are sufficient to direct and maintain the whole. But in a popular state, a democratic state, one spring more is necessary, namely virtue. And he has a variety of virtues in mind, but the one that seems to show up most often, I think, concerns prudence. He says at another point in the book, some pages later, in a well-regulated democracy where people's expenses should extend only to what is necessary, everyone ought to have it, for how should their wants be otherwise supplied. Have it, meaning some kind of prudence, some kind of inhibited or restricted sense of what they wanted from government, so that the cost of providing it could be met with their willingness to pay taxes to provide it. So he was much concerned about this tension between a voter's demand for goods and services and their willingness to pay for it through higher taxes. And I guess he had the impression, and I don't know how common this was historically because I'm not familiar with any cases like this outside of ancient Greece, that people voters would demand more services than they would would favor taxes to pay for. So the democratic governments had a tendency to become bankrupt through time as their expenditures exceeded their tax revenues. Not because taxes weren't potentially feasible, that would pay for their services, but because voters were unwilling to vote in favor of such taxes. He also argued that democracies are more robust when a nation's leaders are also actively engaged in commerce. And I think what he has in mind in this case is the Dutch experience, which is not too far from northern France. And it would be a story that most people would be familiar with in France. In fact, many French Protestants left France for the Netherlands and presumably maintained family relationships with people back in France. So some of this information would be direct. True is it that when a democracy is founded on commerce, private people may acquire vast riches without a corruption of morals. This is because the spirit of commerce is naturally attended with that of frugality, economy, moderation, labor, prudence, tranquility, order, and rule. So long as the spirit subsists, the riches it produces have no bad effect. The mischief is when excessive wealth destroys the spirit of commerce. Then it is that the inconveniences of inequality begin to be felt. So what he has in mind here is that as long as people basically regard the wealth as being a consequence of a person's kind of productive effort, there is no tension in the society generated by differences in wealth. It's when that difference in wealth is considered to be, in some sense, independent of one's effort and talent and contribution to society, that tension in the distribution of wealth begins to emerge. In order to support this spirit, commerce should be carried on by the principal citizens. This should be their sole aim and study. This the chief object of the laws. So this is a fairly strong claim. It's in a way analogous to Locke's claim about governments being formed to protect the property of individuals, or chiefly for that aim. This is a claim that government officials should be studying commerce and try to understand how it operates and act to try to facilitate and extend it. So this should be their sole aim and study. This is the chief object of the laws, that is to promote the prosperity of the kingdom or territory being governed. As true of Aristotle and the court, Montesquieu believed that laws can support or undermine virtues such as industry. An example is inheritance laws. In fact, I think it's the only one he mentions. But it's an interesting example and not one that's intuitively obvious. It is an excellent law in a trading republic to make an equal division of the paternal estate among the children. The consequence of this is that however great a fortune the father has made, his children, being not as rich as he, are induced to avoid luxury and to work as he has done. I speak here only of trading republics. As to those that have no commerce or little commerce, the legislator must pursue quite different measures. So I think the argument that he's making there explicitly is fairly clear. The exception to the rule that he has in mind is, of course, the old medieval system of family-based rule, and in a sense his own wealth, which he inherited as from his mother and uncle. In those societies, normally the wealth of the father goes to the oldest son, if there is one, or to the oldest son in a related family, a nephew or a niece or a nephew, for example, and occasionally to the oldest woman descendant in the family, but usually the man, and usually it's undivided. And this is part of that medieval system because such inheritance rules leads to a concentration of wealth and power that helps us cement the authority of these noble families in their regions and make it really difficult for people to kind of overthrow them. Because essentially, if you get on their wrong side, you lose all your businesses and you may well lose your property and the farmland that you're used to tending, because much of the farmland in this period was in a sense owned by the local noble and leased or rented to the farmers who lived in their baronies, in their territories, on their farms in effect. So he goes on to talk about ethics and markets, both good effects that markets have on ethics, and bad effects that markets have on ethics. And if you think about the various authors we're reading today, and to some extent next time, you would see that, say, Lecourt was very supportive of markets and regarded commerce to be a blessing, and not to have any conflict with moral development. Montesquieu is more concerned. He has reservations. He sees good things and bad things about markets. Smith, as we'll see next time, is somewhat more supportive than Montesquieu, but perhaps has more reservations, has more concerns than those of Lecourt. And if you look at Franklin, who we'll deal with shortly, Franklin has essentially almost no concern about markets being corrupting, that the virtues it takes to survive and flourish in markets are good virtues, and if you lack those virtues, you tend not to succeed, and so markets indirectly support virtuous behavior and reward it more or less directly. So I would say his support may be a little bit less than Lecourt's, but it's certainly more than more than Smith's, and Smith's is more than Montesquieu's. And if you were to look at the per capita GDPs of these four places, you would see that they are basically in that rank order, that the Netherlands was the wealthiest of the four. The American colonies, in terms of the average income of individuals, was higher than that of England, which was higher than that of France. Okay, not necessarily in terms of GDP, but certainly in terms of average income. So Montesquieu, in speaking on the good things about commerce is a cure for the most destructive prejudices, for it is almost a general rule that whenever we find agreeable manners, there commerce flourishes, and that wherever there is commerce, there we meet with agreeable manners. Let us not be astonished then if our manners are now less savage than formerly. Commerce has everywhere diffused a knowledge of the manners of all nations. These are compared with one another, and from this comparison arise the greatest advantages. So that international trade or interregional trade have this beneficial effect on manners and other internalized rules of conduct, in that traders observe what types of conduct tend to increase trust, increase the ability to consummate bargains, trades, and those practices tend to be adopted by all traders. And in Montesquieu's opinion, those practices are much nicer than the manners that would have existed in the absence of trade. And partly this is evolution, and partly this is because in order to trade, both sides have to kind of reach agreements. And if you're too nasty with your trading partners, they'll find other people to trade with. However, he's not completely relaxed about commerce and its effect on ethics. It has some good effects, it has some bad effects. If the spirit of commerce unites nations, it does not in the same manner unite individuals. We see that in countries where the people move only by the spirit of commerce, they make a traffic in all the humane, all the moral virtues. The most trifling things, those which humanity would demand, are there done or they are given only for money. So, that quote is basically arguing that what Aristotle called liberality is not nearly as present in a commercial-based society as it is in some other societies. That much behavior, most behavior, even these nice manners that he mentioned in the other quote, are consequences of the pursuit of money, rather than some kind of internal disposition to behave in a particular way. Those behaviors are means rather than ends, I suppose you could say. So again, to refer back to Aristotle's analysis, Montesquieu, in a sense, is arguing that these folks who are inhabiting commercial societies tend to be motivated only by money to an excessive degree, and therefore are not as virtuous in many dimensions or in many ways as others would be in other types of cultures. A concern that is evident in Aristotle's ranking of occupations, as we mentioned a few lectures back. The spirit of trade produces in the mind of man a certain sense of exact justice, opposite on the one hand to robbery, and on the other those moral virtues which forbid our always adhering rigidly to the rules of private interest, and suffer us neglect this for the advantage of the others. So again, that's a sentence that is indicating kind of a mixed assessment of the effect of markets. You have this sense of who owns what rights people have, and in a respect for those rights. On the other hand, it tends to promote self-interest rather than other virtues which require you to move away from self-interest and take account of the advantages of others. And so this ethical system is a bit different than Aristotle's. It's somewhat more other-oriented than his was, and also it's a little bit different, you can see, than the ones we've looked at before, which are more salvation-oriented, and which is a type of long-term self-interest, I suppose, and not as conscious of the effects of your behavior on others. Not that it's indifferent to them, but it's not the main focus. So we next move on to Ben Franklin. Franklin is, in my view, one of the most amazing individuals that I've run into in terms of my readings. He has, if you think of Locke's discussion of education and virtue, where he says 9 out of 10 people are who they are as ethical as they are, as productive as they are, because of education, rather than because of some kind of essential feature of their character or blood or genetics. I think you'd have to say that Franklin might be that other one, the one who is truly a self-made man. Among many notable Americans of the 18th century was a self-made man, printer, scientist, politician, and philosopher by the name of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was the son of an immigrant to Boston. He attended school at the age of 10, learned the printing and newspaper trade from his brother, and while an apprentice to his brother, taught himself to read, write, and argue well. And his method of learning to write well I find fascinating, and I'm not sure whether it's completely accurate, because most people have a tendency to exaggerate a little bit their past, and Franklin may well have done that. But what he says he did at this in this period as a young teenager, maybe 11, 12, 13, was that he would read some other author and then try to write in exactly the manner of that author. So he'd write a page or two, or maybe a whole essay. In some cases, he would publish the essays in his brother's newspapers. But that was But his idea was to try to mimic the writing style of other people, and so develop an understanding of writing styles, and eventually develop his own style. In doing so, he read works by Aristotle, Plato, Locke, and Mondeville, among many others. As a kind of middle-aged teenager, late teenager, he became a deist and believed that, as many deists did at that time, that there was a kind of causal chain from the beginning of time to the present and on into the future, and that everything that happened on that chain was preordained, was part of a divine plan. And insofar as she regarded the divine being to be benevolent, it implied that whatever happened was both in intent of the divine being and somehow contributed to a good result, as that result would be judged by the divine being. And therefore he concluded that rules of conduct were unimportant, that whatever you did, it was because that was part of the plan. And so there was no particular reason to invest in a rule of conduct unless you were so inclined. He did change his mind about that a few years later, as we'll see in a few minutes. In his late teens, he moved from Boston to Philadelphia. So in this time, in the early 1700s, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, South Carolina were the big cities. Boston and New York were the first big cities, and then Philadelphia became a major city as well some years later, as did Charleston. So in Philadelphia, Franklin became a successful printer, publisher, a civic leader, and a politician, an innovative scientist and an inventor, and subsequently a national statesman. His scientific contributions include demonstrating that lightning was electricity rather than a miracle, and charting and naming the Gulf Stream of the Atlantic Ocean. As an inventor, he invented a type of efficient wood stove. It's still called the Franklin stove. If you shop or look for that on the web, I'm sure you would see pictures of them, and you could still buy them more than roughly 300 years after he invented them. Also, he invented bifocals, which is where you have two different lenses in the same set of glasses, so that the top half has one magnification, the bottom half has another. It's a method that's still widely used today among older folks who need two sets of glasses or two types of magnification in order to be able to see distance and read materials at closer distances to their eyes. Later in life, he served as the governor of Pennsylvania, as ambassador to France, and participated in writing the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Franklin was mostly a practical guy, you know, that is, he's oriented towards life in his city, life in his country, and as well as accumulating wealth for himself and his family. And he was interested in intellectual things because he was a member of some scientific societies, local ones. That's part of the reason he was engaged in the research on electricity. But he was kind of a jack of all trades, really, did a bit of everything. And he also wrote about ethics, and in particular he wrote about ethics and wealth. That is the manner in which you should conduct yourself if you wanted to accumulate wealth. And these rules of conduct have a strong ethical dimension to them. And his interest in ethics started, I believe, when he was in his early 20s, perhaps as a late teenager, where he changed his mind about the merits or the worthwhileness of rules of conduct, of virtues, from that which he held earlier when he was a younger man, teenager. And he says, I grew convinced that truth, sincerity, and integrity in dealings between man and man were of the utmost importance to the felicity of life, to achieving a good life, a happy life. And I formed written resolutions, which still remain in my journal book, to practice them ever while I lived. And what he did was analogous to what he did to learn to write well. He made up a table, and he listed about 10 virtues on the side. And then every day or every week, he would score himself on each one, and he would be trying to improve his scores on the various ethical dimensions until he did well at all of them. And the claim is that eventually he became quite good at all of them except one. And the one he had the most trouble with was modesty. As a person of great talent and pride in his achievements, he had a hard time being modest. But he did find that false modesty was nearly as useful as true modesty. And so I think he gave himself a passing score even on that virtue, which he admits that he never really got particularly good at. As a printer, he would publish almanacs every year and pamphlets and sell them, and this was an extra source of money besides beyond that which he would make for printing up various things and trying to print up newspapers and things of that sort. So he's very entrepreneurial in his printing business, and he invented this character for the almanacs called Poor Richard. And so Poor Richard would make recommendations to ordinary folks who might buy his almanacs and read them by the fire in winter's nights when the days were short. And some of his maxims were gathered together and published as a pamphlet called The Way to Wealth, which is still sold today, by the way. If you go to Pennsylvania, you could find copies of it in Philadelphia. And of course, you probably can find it on the web these days. No need to go to Philadelphia. And so these are quotes from The Way to Wealth, most of them. Advice to a young worker. One other thing before I start is that you'll see that he has a keen sense of the notion of opportunity cost. Well, that idea had not been codified in economics at the time he was writing. It's clear that that's what he has in mind in most of these next series of remarks. And you could say that opportunity cost has not yet been invented, at least in the way economists came to use the term, in part because economics per se had not really been invented yet. Some ideas had been worked out off and on over the years that would eventually become parts of modern economic thinking and part of the domain of economics as we understand it. But the pivotal work in that progression had not yet been written. So the Wealth of Nations would be written 20, 30, 40 years later by Adam Smith. And before that, there was really no single coherent statement about the way markets operate, the way prices emerge, the advantages of specialization, and so forth. Although there were bits and pieces that you could point to as having economic content, including, as I mentioned, when we went through Aristotle, some of his remarks on the emergence of money, the role of money in an economy, and the idea of equilibrium prices, fair prices, generating stable trading ratios across goods. So here's a very nice quote on opportunity cost. Remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and sits idle 1/2 of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion, during his leisure, ought not to reckon that his only expense. He has really thrown away 5 shillings besides. And the opportunity cost of that 5 hours or half a day's leisure was the money he could have earned instead of the leisure. And in that half day, he would have earned 5 shillings. And that's its true opportunity cost, its true cost. He also has some remarks about reputation, that reputation really matters in credit markets, but also in final goods market when you sell things. You'll see there are 2 quotes that deal with that. Here's the first. The most trifling actions that affect a man's credit are to be regarded carefully. The sound of your hammer at 5 in the morning or 9 at night, heard by a creditor, makes him easy 6 months longer. But if he sees you at a billiard table or hears your voice in a tavern when you should be at work, he sends for his money the next day. Creditors are the kind of people that have the sharpest eyes and ears, as well as the best memories of any in the world. Of course, credit markets were more personal in the days that he's writing in than they are today. But you can see that the same logic would tend to apply in other contexts, in modern contexts as well. The reputation for being diligent, active in your trade, and so forth are things that creditors like to hear about rather than goofing off, using their money for pleasure instead of as an investment. In short, the way to wealth, if you desire it, is as plain as the way to market. It depends chiefly on 2 words, industry and frugality. Waste neither time nor money, but make the best use of both. He that gets all that he can honestly and saves all he can will certainly become rich. So you can see in this quote that there are some virtues creeping in here. These are virtues that his readers are going to be taking for granted. The idea that industry and frugality are both good things. He doesn't defend them, but he mentions that they are a means to an end. In this case, a means to material comforts. He also mentions honestly, that is that honesty is an important aspect of this way to wealth, as is saving. Okay, saving would be part of frugality, I suppose. So the 3 virtues he mentions here in passing, industry, frugality, and honesty, are virtues that tend to be compatible with increasing one's wealth. And indeed, he would argue necessary for it, unless you're already rich to begin with. With respect to industry, friends said poor Richard, the taxes are very heavy, and if laid on by the government, if those laid on by the government were the only ones we had to pay, we might more easily discharge them. But we have many others, and much more grievous to some of us. The others have to do with opportunity cost again. We are taxed twice as much by our idleness, 3 times as much by our pride, 4 times as much by our folly. And from these taxes, the tax commissioners, cannot ease or deliver us by allowing an abatement. So again, there are costs to engaging in what in this time would be regarded as vices, excessive pride, idleness, folly. These are behaviors to be avoided. And doing so are again aligned with increasing one's wealth. Nonetheless, so there's a lot of talk about acquiring wealth and these quotes. There are virtues running around in the background that facilitate that acquisition of wealth and are necessary. He wants the wealth to be generated honestly rather than dishonestly, for example. And he makes this point in a way clearer in this next quote. Drive thy business, let not that drive thee. And early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, Poor Richard says. I think that's one of the most famous quotes from Franklin's writings. At least I heard it when I was growing up, and it may not be quite as commonly said today as it was back then, but still not uncommon, even if no longer emphasized, I suppose. But the first part of the quote is important, and that's less famous. Drive thy business, let not that drive thee. In other words, your business, your quest for wealth shouldn't be the only thing that drives you. It's also important to be healthy and to accumulate wisdom as you live, not simply to accumulate wealth. So there are other goals that you need to take into account. And again, this is similar to Aristotle's point, I suppose, that you should not be excessively focused on money making, but do so in a reasonable and balanced way with respect to other virtues that you might wish to acquire. In this case, wisdom and health. And generally speaking, Franklin does not believe that there's a strong tension between engaging in market activities successfully and virtuous conduct. He does acknowledge that there are short-term temptations, but he would insist that if you have a long-term orientation, there essentially is little or no tension, at least between the virtues he's interested in and accumulating significant wealth during your lifetime. And here's a quote on this point. There are a great many retailers who falsely imagine that being historical, the modern phrase for lying, modern in his time, is much for their advantage. And some of them have a saying that it's a pity that lying is a sin. It is so useful in trade. If they were to examine into the reason why a number of shopkeepers raise considerable estates while others who have set out with better fortunes have become bankrupts, they would find that the former made up with truth, diligence, and probity what they were deficient of in stock, while the latter have been found guilty of imposing on such customers as they found no skill in the quality of their goods. That last phrase is not the most easy to decode. Imposing on such customers as they found had no skill in the quality of their goods. Their customers found that the merchants had no skill in the quality of their goods, neither picked out the best goods for their customers, nor produced them themselves, and therefore lost their customers to others who did, or perhaps cheated them in some ways, and again lost customers to people who were more truthful with them. And thus there's really no trade-off in the long run between these virtues that Franklin is emphasizing and the long run accumulation of wealth or material comfort. Franklin's writing is often for sale, for popular consumption, for his readership, and obviously you have to sell a lot of pamphlets to make money from them, and he did. So the ideas that we've just discussed about the connection between virtue and acquiring wealth are ones that were congenial with his readership, and ones that they might try to pass on to their children by encouraging them to read Franklin's stories and almanacs. This next piece is written more for intellectuals, I suppose, in his community. And it's basically an argument that self-denial is not the essence of virtue. And that's an argument that's still commonplace today. And I think his example is kind of a nice one. It's one that's compatible with Aristotle's ideas of self-discipline and self-mastery, as you'll see in a second. If to a certain man idle diversions have nothing in them that is tempting, and therefore he never relaxes his application to business for their sake, is he not an industrious man? Or has he not the virtue of industry? I might in like manner instance in all the rest of the virtues, but to make the thing short, as it is certain that the more we strive against the temptation to any vice and practice the contrary virtue, the weaker will that temptation be, and the stronger will be that habit, till at length the temptation has no force or entirely vanishes. So that if you resist temptation, practice virtue, that temptation will become weaker and weaker and weaker, have less force on you. In a sense, you're starting to exhibit self-mastery in this one area of decision-making. Does it follow from thence that in our endeavors to overcome vice, we grow continually less and less virtue till at length we have no virtue at all? Because we're no longer engaging in self-denial in order to be virtuous. We've actually had the habit of virtuosity, and no longer feel those temptations. So there's a kind of contradiction in that other point of view that Franklin is pointing out here in a kind of clear and kind of pithy way, with again illustrations that have some connection back to economics and the role of commerce in a person's good life.